So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Today, I would like to welcome all of you for our second webinar in a series of IRB Hot topics here. Initially, we had been rather having the intention to discuss the subject related to low default portfolio, but we later on reached to the conclusion it would be a better idea actually to dedicate one full session after the summer break in September, October this year on this topic. So today we will be, instead of that, rather talking another important subject, which has been in the recent weeks and months. One of the key topics that has been inquired by various banking contacts of PwC network, which is the IRB optimization, given the new regime, given the new optionalities available to us. And in parallel to that, we would like to talk also about representativeness issue, which is maybe not directly related to that, but it is still a big token of problem for many banks currently undergoing to so-called inspection by local as well as ECB teams, by local regulatory or ECB teams. And later on, my colleague Louis will be briefly discussing the divergence and convergence with respect to IRB and IFRS 9 frameworks. We would like as well, finally, spend a good portion of our time on climate and environmental risk factors and the way they should be or they need to be integrated in the credit risk models. And in that process, where do we stand at this moment in time? Who we are, you can find out here on this page. I think we are valuable colleagues from different parts of PwC network in Europe. We have Ozan, manager from German PwC credit risk quant team. We have Jose from the risk modeling and analytics team, Portugal, and we have Luis, my dear colleague, with whom we had been hosting this event for the last, as far as I remember, 8 years. Okay, let us discuss briefly what is optimization, what do we want to talk about it in the context of IRB. In the post-IRB repair world, this will be another subject of focus. Basically, we need to identify areas and pockets of opportunities for better risk-weighted asset estimation. The reason being is in the fast-track model development exercises just before the IRB repair or during the IRB repair engagements, we really didn't have much time to look into all the details that needs to be taken care of. And we have been swapping most of our deficiencies under the blanket of MOC. So in a nutshell, MOC optimization is one of the target areas where we would like to reflect the less conservative approaches, enhance the data, and generally methodologies as such. We have less MOC than what we had been earlier, for instance, put together. But there are actually three dimensions to the discussion here. One dimension is the capital efficiency, and the second dimension is profitability, and the last dimension is how we can use the accurate estimates, enabling banks to allocate resources based on their true risk exposure rather than elevated ones through different means of regulatory push that has led to this. Three dimensions as well is there, how we can improve it. One of them is basically better methods related to calibration, related to MOC estimation, related to as well better data, the second dimension, and finally better strategy. Strategy lies here in the context of choice we have to make when it comes to IRB. We are having right now the option permanently go back to standardized approach at least 20% for if in a given asset class or certain asset classes completely, we can move back to a standardized approach, which wasn't in the past possible given the requirements in place. Some other key areas that I'd like to discuss with you, I would like to reflect right now on the slide here. Some key areas in IRB optimization and their impact I can summarize here. We can, as an example, improve the LGD models by looking to data. In the past, for instance, data might not have been available for some of the recovery processes. In cases such as that, additional drawings were approximated under circumstances by monthly differences of outstanding, which obviously can be improved by sourcing out better transactional information or by re-landscaping of all LGD models with a potential release, significant potential release of risk-weighted assets. And that in turn as well might lead to changes in MOC quantification. LGD estimation methodology is generally being suffering a lot by heavy MOC layers because we usually had issues with simulation of recovery data. Either the write-off periods were too not necessarily reflected in the data, or they were actually too short or sometimes even too long. In either case, changes in quantification of MOC leads automatically to some improvement. It's an iterative calculation basically, and the impact can be assessed easily. Another example is the day past due counter in historical simulation based on new DOD estimation assessment during the COVID period was very much driven by the range of variability on PD estimates. So potentially changing the time frames of model calibration based on post-COVID analysis might decrease significantly the range of variability. There are also a number of deficiencies related to policies and processes that in return might have a significant impact based on the CRR3 of actual implementation exercise. What we can observe is that any change not necessarily can lead to increase in MOC, but might lead as well to decrease. That needs mathematically proven and tested. This is if we have to reflect that in a way how a project in this context should look like. Let me give you a snapshot that might enable you to have better visual grasp of how this can work. First of all, we list all areas that might be leading to some improvements. In other words, we create an inventory of all deficiencies, then we categorize them, and then identify items which relate to initial inherent conservatism that have been in place, which might be right now relaxed or completely deleted, simply because we are having better methodologies or better data. Then we prioritize the improved areas. We prioritize deficiencies and their impact. And look for solutions. Respective modeling decisions might be taken under the loop, as well as improved processes might be taken under the assessment if and when this might lead to better data quality. Then we look to approaches for optimization. Recalculate MOC if it's related to MOC. Recalculate, fix the data and improve the methodologies and find out what the impact's going to be in terms of risk weights, assets. And then obviously we'll document that. There are two types of in such projects and deliverables. The first one is categories listed for improvement and impact potentially. Then a cost benefit analysis and identification of so-called quick fixes and those that might require structural improvement, which might be rather a long-term initiative. Example being if data has been sitting in multiple cash flow databases, you might be standardizing and unify the data for LGD estimation related to recoveries. So this is usually a very long-term engagement rather than a short-term one. And the second phase is obviously how we improve the methodologies by improving the code as well. The impact assessment is naturally the next step where mitigation related impact could be easily numerically captured. Obviously, That will be covered later on by relevant documentation of the relevant codes. Well, here we can see how the listing can be done. Here, basically listing all relevant deficiencies, missing and inaccurate information source of cash flows, materiality changes, default triggers, deficiency related to policies, missing or inaccurate data on risk drivers, or general lack of representatives of risk drivers, and the impact. And we usually choose only the high and medium impact out of all, because when in reality you create such a list, the list is not any shorter than 40 or 50 items. So you need to understand that you can't improve everything. You just need to focus on the ones that are more relevant. What happens then next? Very simple. At next stage, you try to implement if, or example, or case study goes related to MOC reduction, you will be indeed looking to deficiencies related to missing items, which had been missing in the past, but could be recovered, first of all, right now. So based on the delta, outstanding might be less. The approaches might be more conservative in the past, but might be adjusted, or some assumptions might be relaxed, which will lead to a certain better LGD estimate. Always a subsample of portfolio, which was initially used for the implementation purposes, need to be retested. And this is sufficient usually to apply a downward appropriate adjustment, basically. Secondly, deficiency related to historical default triggers might be one of the key findings where we might be able to improve the situation. Here, obviously, we need also a parallel run historically that need to perform month on month or daily for a certain time period to make sure that our assessment is basically correct. And lastly, could be as well deficiencies related to some changes. In the past, you might have been applying certain rules that might not have been in the place right now after changes in policies, which obviously might speed up the process. But then again, this might improve the situation with the quality of data, which in return might again have significant positive feedback in the loop. So in a nutshell, it's an iterative process, but obviously we all know when we were running the so-called IRB repair programs, we were moving by light speed. We were not even having any chance to look into nitty-gritty stuff. But now is the time to look back and find out where we have made some stumble stones, some hurdles where we might still be looking back and try to improve. And that's exactly what several banks have been doing right now. MOC is the easiest, I think, the most notable area where we want to concentrate. But above all, we need in either case, when we have a hypothesis where we might be able to improve risk weight assets, we need to estimate the cost effort associated with improvement, because not every effort is worth trying. Not every effort will bring me the improvement in risk weight assets terms. So we need to understand how much risk weight assets I can release within a predefined budget cost framework, how much effort is needed, and to what kind of level of expected improvement that might lead. Having said that, I'd like to now hand the word to my colleague Ozan on a topic which is a big headache for many banks, and many clients of us have been continuously asking us, what does that mean? How ECB wants to have this being reflected in the model development context for both PD and LGD. And we'd like to iteratively discuss this, because this is going forward to be as well another important area of focus for ECB and for the local regulators such as Bundesbank, Dutch National Bank, etc., etc. So, Ozan, the floor is yours. Please try to explain us why is that so difficult, and why many banks are failing to meet the minimum expectations on representativeness, please.
Yes, thanks, Kaan. So hi, everyone. Today we have this bonus topic, as Kaan explained, because, yes, we receive a lot of questions around this analysis. which called as mix of good year, bad year analysis, and it's part of the representativeness framework from the guidelines of EBA guidelines on PD and LGD estimation. And also one point is this representative framework, the all dimensions inside of the representativeness gains a bit more importance since this European energy crisis, because now it becomes more relevant where the application portfolio shifts. So this mix of good year, bad year analysis is just one of the dimensions that you can see as current and foreseeable economical or market conditions. And specifically, this analysis is conducted for the PD. And the main purpose is indeed when we develop the PD model, whether we are covering a full economical cycle in our development data. And that's why mainly the requirements for such an analysis, it's mentioned inside of the long run average calculation, because then the ultimate expectation that long run average would reflect both good years and bad years. So I should go to the next slide. Yes. So here, okay, from regulatory perspective, it's mandatory to conduct such an analysis, but what is the meaning of such an analysis? What's the purpose or why it's required by regulation? It's simply reflecting, as I mentioned, full economical cycle during the development, because it's usually the case when the model developed only based on good years, the data covers only good years. It means that when the bad years come, the model quality might be decreased quite a lot, and it probably would lead some underestimation of the PD. Vice versa, when the model development data set includes too many bad years, when it's overrepresented, and the model developed based on such a data set, it might lead unnecessary conservatism in the PD estimations. That's why it requires some kind of appropriate adjustment to keep the PD levels in their reasonable levels. So this is roughly the purpose of this analysis. And in the next slide, I will mention about how to conduct such an analysis. So we have actually 4 main steps to define such an analysis. These main steps involves both assessing like what is actually a bad year for us, how we define a bad year, how can we quantize such a thing to define a bad year, how do we use macroeconomic variables, because to also monitor where we are in the economical cycle, it's necessary to make such an analysis from macroeconomic variables. Another point is whether our RDS is sufficiently long to determine whether we have enough bad years, or like how to define a bad year mainly, what should be the threshold for bad year. And usually for most of the banks, the earliest year that RDS started, it's around 2008. And it's like approximately 16, 17 years of data. And it's usually still not sufficient to define a threshold to assign some years as bad years, some years as good years. So that's why we need more longer period, which we call as extended period, to history, to like retrospective extrapolation, to ensure such a like long period to be able to see at least several economical cycles. Then that would help us to define a threshold for our PDs eventually. So the one common mistake we see usually, the banks do such an analysis by only using macroeconomic variables, but not using their own default rates. However, it's quite important to make such an analysis by reflecting for each bank's own default experience. In the other end, like default rates itself, it's not sufficient, because then by using only the default rates, it's not possible to define a reasonable threshold to assign some years as bad, some years as good years. So that's the whole purpose of the analysis. Step by step, we extrapolate our default rates. Then based on these default rates, we identify what is the expected number of bad years for us for the portfolio that we have. It's like depends on the country, for example, depends on the portfolio type, the exposure type. And with this extrapolation, we define a threshold, and eventually within our RDS, we define which years are bad years, which years are good years, and whether they are in the expected level. So in the next slide, I will little bit dive deeper to show you the concept. So here you see three different macroeconomic indicators. It's like for example purposes, it's the quite common ones. GDP, unemployment rate. It's also required to use in downturn estimation. Indeed, this analysis not really the downturn analysis, but it has some fundamental similarities. That's why such factors are still make sense to use independent from portfolio type. But then there should be some additional macroeconomic variables indeed that reflects that like connected with the product types in the portfolio that you are developing this PD model. So the idea is to have a bit benchmark, like what is the expected number of bad years. So we now investigating 33 years, and whatever number of bad years that we see based on the macroeconomic indicators, proportionally we should see the same number of bad years within our RDS observation period. So here, for example, different macroeconomic indicators has different number of bad years, and this is for us creates a kind of a range that what should be the expected number of bad years. And in the table you can see with the symbol proportion, we see that like okay, if we see for example 6 to 9 years in this extended period, then in the 16 years of RDS, we see it's like it should be 3 to 4 years to call it's like represented. Okay, then this is one part of the analysis, but the other part is still defining that which years are bad years for us. And this is shown in the next slide. Here in the right-hand side, you see extrapolated default rates to backwards. So for example, our default rate starts somewhere around 2010 approximately, and the extended period goes until 1990. So this is indeed by itself a model, right? We just estimate a default rates, even though it's backwards, not forward. Still, it's a model by using some, again, macroeconomic indicators inside of the model. And as soon as we have this this long period of history, even though it's estimated, then by using the expected number of bad years, we define a PD threshold based on percentiles. So that whatever that threshold is in your default rate levels, in your default experience, when you define this threshold based on this long default rates period, then you see in actual observed default rates which years actually falls into the levels that that default rate indicates the bad years. And from the previous slide, I mentioned that the range for expected number of bad years, and eventually we evaluate whether number of bad years that we see within our expectation. Indeed, if it's overrepresented or underrepresented, we should have some follow-up actions, usually appropriate adjustment and mock, very generic, but like indeed the appropriate adjustment changes depending on the situation, depending whether we have underestimation or overestimation. But mock is always there to eliminate any kind of bias. So in a nutshell, this is the mix of good year, bad year analysis for PD models. This is usually how it's done to make sure that like we are both reflecting the default rates of the portfolio, and we're also using the macroeconomic indicators to define such a number of bad years and make sure that our data really shows this kind of sufficient number of bad years. So that's pretty much all for this analysis. Now I will hand over to Luis.
Ozan, some questions arrived. Maybe we just
Right.
address. Yeah, you might want to address them right away. One of them is question is based on practices, which is the optimal full horizon to consider for representativeness in this question. Whoever asking the question, in our case, we use observed period of 15 years. For the later, we should consider less observation period, for example, 10 years for IFRS 9 or not, is the question. But I think we are mostly here relating our discussion to IRB, so IFRS 9 is not necessarily the framework for which we have been discussing this, right?
Yes, indeed, the requirements for IFRS 9 in this topic, it's not as strict as we discuss in IRB oriented and like requirements from the guidelines. So, for example, 16 years of period, it's whether it's sufficient or not. It's by RDS. If the length of your RDS is 15 years, yeah, as RDS it's sufficient. But the reason that we do this kind of extrapolation backwards, we don't know in 15 years the number of expected bad years might not be that high. So to make sure that the analysis we do, the thresholds that we define, or like number of bad years in longer period of history, it becomes a little bit robust. Because if we say, for example, let's say we expect 1 bad year out of 4 years, so this is the average value, but it's not the case. Sometimes it's happened once in 10 years, sometimes it's happened once in 3 years, and to make sure to get a reasonable average or expected number of bad years, the time frame should be longer. That's why we do this extrapolation to observe more variability in the default rates.
Okay, here with I'd like to call in my colleague Luis, who will. Thanks a lot, Ozan. I think the answer is sufficient for that. Luis will be discussing about the divergence and convergence between IRB and IFRS 9 frameworks. Luis, please.
Yes, it is not me yet, so it will be Jose. Jose, please step in.
Hello, everyone. So we bring a topic which already are having questions regarding the consistency between IRB and IFRS 9. This is for sure a topic that is being heating up for the past years. So maybe moving to the first. It's already past to be. Sorry. So ECB, just to give a bit of context, ECB has been benchmarking basically the IFRS 9s across the industry, and what has been the conclusions is that there are still relevant gaps between what is the modeling standards that are being considered in IRB vis-a-vis those that are considered for the IFRS 9. So what we have been discussing a lot is, and we see with the banks that we engage with, is a path for moving from what are the main conclusions that the industry has taken from their IRB repair programs, and bring that experience for the IFRS 9 space. Of course, IRB and IFRS 9 models may have some points of contact, but not all is applicable. So banks need to be quite intelligent in the way that they want to bring this consistency between the two worlds, and be very strategic in the areas where they maintain some aspects that are different between the two realities. What we are going to give further detail is more on the LGD and CCF side, regarding experiences that we have recently, and basically what we want to go in detail are general topics that are typically being the most relevant situations for the industry. So Regarding the requirements that are specific to IFRS 9 and IRB, of course, they are not the same. So the regulatory context is quite distinct, with IRB being much more detailed on what are the expectations regarding the ways that risk should be quantified in terms of PDs and LGDs and CCF models. In that sense, of course, there are topics that are not applicable, as the MUC component or other requirements in the case of LGDs, the discounting of recoveries, but other distinctions have been observed. And to give a practical example, in some situations, even the way that, for example, LGDs or PDs are determined in terms of using an exposure-weighted approach, or in the case of PDs, not considering the long run average as a perspective of time, but as a full, as a playing field for every exposure. Typically, these are areas where best practices that are gained in IRB can be brought to the IFRS 9. Going to other topics, in the sectorial perspective has been increasingly having more predominance, since there is a difference in terms of what is the outlook of the so-called novel risks. These novel risks can go through what are cases like geopolitical risks, ESG, and other sources of risks that are not typically reflected in the legacy of data. So, in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic period, which is of course idiosyncratic event, one of the main issues was how to embed this in the models, and different sectors, of course, would have here would observe different impacts from such events. So, sectoral perspective is for sure a topic of the future. This is also aligned with the perception that ECB has detailed in a recent document from July 2024, specific on novel risks, where it is detailed that banks are still roughly doing the incorporation of novel risks in their IFRS 9 models, having an approach very focused on the ACL as a whole, and not being able to bring the idiosyncrasies of the impacts inside of their parameters, linked to what are the most exposed portfolios. And so, in that sense, the sectoral perspective is for sure something to have in consideration in the way that we incorporate such risks. Basically, the practice has been trying to, via the forward-looking component, try to create here the dynamics of how such risks are embedded in the IFRS 9 models. In terms of DoD and the specific treatments that are done to deal with the COVID period, what is relevant to highlight is that in recent calibrations, what we observe is that in the IRB, there is already specific methodologies to deal with the appropriate adjustments that are specific to adjust default rates or to adjust recoveries in the case of LGDs. And what we observe is that in the IFRS 9 side, sometimes or typically we don't see some alignment on the way that the bank can do these adjustments. Even the techniques that are being employed may be rather distinct. This is, of course, an area where some convergence can be done. It creates a more robust storyline, even on how the banking does the interpretation of the impacts arising from both a case like the period of COVID and the impacts that are arising from the implementation of the OD in a back score kind of approach. In terms of scope of application, it's relevant to note that if one wants to consider what is the information of IRB and somehow do an adaptation to the IFRS 9 environment, bringing some efficiency on how the data is managed across the modeling landscape. One of the topics that needs to be taken into consideration is for sure that there are typically some differences on what is the scope of application of the IRB and what we see in the IFRS 9 side. Please note that whatever IRB is being not applied due to the partial use portfolios, these for sure may be portfolios that are relevant for IFRS 9, and in that sense representative, if one wants to maintain perfect alignment, representative analysis should be performed to make sure that the IRB environment is also, or the IRB scope is also a good match for whatever is outside of this application scope. In what concerns the low default portfolios, if for IRB there is already a lot of effort to be able to perform risk modeling in this context, for the IFRS 9 this is even or maybe as equal or even worse in the IFRS 9 side, with imposition of deriving lifetime PDs, and in that sense typically what we have been seeing is a simplification of the way that the low default portfolios are incorporated inside the ECL calculation vis-a-vis what is the effort that is being done in the IRB side. Regarding in the sense of if of the IRB structure in terms of what are the calibrations performed that are coming from the IRB repair program, what has been the common practice also is to embed what was the effort to create the granularity or the risk grade structure to be applied in IRB in bringing to IFRS 9. Bringing to IFRS 9 implies that sometimes what we observe is that granularity that was dissected in the IRB environment is too much for the IFRS 9, and some kind of aggregation may be needed to be performed to allow creating the IFRS 9 lifetime curves, and somehow create the communication with the secret criteria. From the credit risk mitigation side, also what we have been observing is the way that some credit mitigants are embedded in the regulatory capital calculation are not fully aligned, or somehow are not even considered in the IFRS 9 side in what is the way that Pillar 1 approach is performed. What this means is that one of two solutions are typically used, or banks go through the modeling side and basically embedding their models as some specific type of guarantees, or they go through the substitution effect. And through the substitution effect, meaning PD and LGD will be from the grantor, this is not something that sometimes is correctly embedded in the ECL calculation, and there can be some type of convergence in the way that the bank deals with these mitigants. In what concerns the level of overlays, in going back to the comment that I did before regarding the new ECB benchmark on novel risks, it's quite relevant to highlight that ECB has concluded that although novel risks are still a challenge for banks, overlays is the best solution at the moment. Nevertheless, ECB is advising for the overlays to be performed based on more statistical based approach and not so much on the expert side with simple adjustments via a GDP alteration or adjustment, and once more, the overlays are typically being applied over the ACL as a whole and ignoring the dynamics that can have inside the ACL calculation, such as, for example, staging migrations. In what concerns the secret thresholds, most relevant topic here is we have been seeing a lot of work being done by the industry on their AWS models, so early warning signal models, and these are a powerful tool to be embedded inside the secret criteria as a way to feed the identification of stage 2 exposure. Last but not least, of course, convergence between IRB and IFRS 9 is not just a question of modeling or adjustment of some requirements, but it also goes to standards. Standards meaning in what concerns, for one side, the documentation that supports all the model structure, as well as the quality standards of data. And here, for sure, this is one of the most relevant vectors in this alignment in IRB and IFRS 9. So, going to the last point, in terms, if the adjustment between PDs in the IRB and IFRS 9 is something that, at least from our experience, has been clearly more embedded in terms on what is the path and how to do it. For the LGDs and CCFs, it still remains as a challenge, and for sure, what are the main axes where we see that convergence may be acquired and can bring for sure robustness to the IFRS 9 model as a whole. For one side, the RDS supporting all the modeling process. Here, this is no doubt one of the most key convergence that one may do, since not only the synergies that are associated with all the data collection, data treatments, and data quality controls that one may have on its historical data for recoveries, which is typically hard to manage. So maintaining 2 RDSs can be quite burdening for the development teams. In the side of the segmentation, it makes sense to have at least an overall story to tell supervisors, meaning if one in IRB says that recovery patterns are very much based on some specific collateralization levels, or there is other specific risk drivers that need to be embedded in the modeling component, even the IFRS 9 makes all the sense that at least on the overall story that there should be some kind of alignment. Even though if we change costs, if we change the discount rate to adapt to the IFRS 9 world, of course there may be some difference. But nevertheless, the risk drivers that are supporting all the process should not be structurally different. From the model design perspective, here we would say that this is one of the most challenging components. Sometimes what we see is a big difference between how LGDs are considered for IRB and how LGDs are designed for IFRS 9, with differences being quite structural, and changes here typically derive a lot of impact, being the LGD a parameter that is very sensitive vis-a-vis what is their ACL impact. And so we see a lot of situations where, for example, in the IRB side, we have LGDs in a pool-based model or continuous model, and when we go to the IFRS 9 side, something based on components is the most observed situation, and trying to bring everything together can be quite challenging. Last but not least, the point in time in forward-looking adjustment. Here, in the specific case of LGDs and CCFs, This is for sure something that is widely discussed with at least from our perception, there is a lot of banks still not doing anything, or trying to go through a point-in-time calibration and somehow putting the forward-looking adjustment on hold due to the sensitivity of the LGD model to ECL. For sure, here building a framework that allows the bank to defend why to go to only a calibration point in time, or doing the forward-looking adjustment, and how the two communicate is a structural strategy to be able to discuss internally and externally with model reviewers. Last but not least, IRB regulatory topics that can be embedded in IFRS 9. So main topics that we highlight here for the LGDs, I think it is not new. The regulatory floor, the long run being number-based, which we are still observing a lot of cases where exposure weights are still the way to derive LGDs in the IFRS 9 side, typically in the corporate portfolios. In the case of CCFs, it's relevant to highlight the structural changes that CRR3 are bringing, namely in the scope of models that are subject to IRB, and this can have an impact on the way that the bank sees its model landscape, even for IFRS 9, and if it makes sense to still have in their IFRS 9 models CCF parameters that are based on observed data and not something more expert driven. Realize CCFs with a fixed horizon approach for the with a 12-month fixed horizon approach. It's for sure for some portfolios quite demanding in terms of data availability, because this also communicates with a long-run CCF that is derived as the arithmetic average of the yearly averages. Our experience is that these two combined, assumptions combined, will increase a lot the need for abundant data to derive robust CCF parameters. Last but not least, the product mix and region of instability are for sure concepts that are now well embedded in the industry and need to be brought to the IFRS 9 environment. And I think from my side, that's it.
Great. So trying now to compensate. So in terms of C risk factors, so I think we all have this question about where do we stand. We know that much has evolved in the last years, particularly in the last 3 years. There are some lessons. There are, of course, some new opportunities and a new context that we are living today. So trying here to recover basically, the fundamentals of all these discussions. So we know that when we look to the IRB framework, there are 3 main challenges that for sure need to be here considered. So basically, many of the I will say the events that are related with CE, they have not been observed in the past. We know that is a situation that is somehow been facing a continuous, I will say, increase of frequency and also severity of many of the events. This is a question that we don't find very easily in our reference data sets, evidences that support typically the selection of what could be fundamental risk drivers for explaining, as I said, increase of default frequency or also high level of defaults and therefore the impact also on recoveries. We also know that from the IRB perspective, in many situations, the approaches that are used, they are more linked to very, very specific standards that are less flexible to this kind of climate risks, which have a very specific profile. So the typical logistic regressions most often are not sufficiently flexible to understand what could be the reality ahead of us. And last but not least, in the last years with the IRB repair program, it also for the SSM banks with the trim inspections and the post-trim inspections, we have seen that there is a clear focus on the quantitative aspects. So the testing and the analysis, they are much more standardized. So this is a complex environmental or reality to somehow to bring new information and to properly address and also to pass the scrutiny that we have seen from, for instance, the ECB in terms of assessing model performance and in particular of each risk driver that is being considered. On the other hand, what we all know, and here we have several quotes from publications, many of them from the ECB, and in particular, the ECB is also being very active in trying to somehow provide to the public further evidences of the importance of what could be climate and environmental issues. And clearly here, these codes signal the fact that from a corporate perspective, we know that we'll have higher energy costs. We know that there will be a green transition that needs to be funded, and therefore the firm's profitability will be negatively impact, leading to higher PD at firm level. We also know that this increase will not be so significant in the first years. It will be aggravated in the following years, but all of these will be highly dependent on the scenario that we are living. So as you can see on the bottom, on the graph on the left, if we face a more accelerated transition, yes, the companies will face all these contexts in terms of increase of costs, therefore their PDs will tend to increase fast and then it will slow down. If we have a more delayed scenario, we'll not face immediately, we'll not have to pay the costs and to fund all the investments that are required immediately, but then later on we'll somehow have to support the consequences. Another characteristic of all this context is that the effects of the transition, they will not be homogeneous across the sectors. Indeed, we see a lot of differences in terms of what are the expected increase in terms of PDs. So as you can see, also depending on the scenario that we are going to face, you can see that sectors like manufacturing or transportation or water supply, yes, they will face immediately a most significant increase on the at PD level. And therefore, what we have here is the evidences that it will be very important. In some cases, it is already impacting how the companies are performing, but we don't have historical evidence of data in our data sets that somehow will fully size what could be the effects at each company level. And that's basically the context that we are living. Under this scenario, we have seen in the last year several publications, both from EBA and ECB, very clearly here, and trying to be short in this long story. What EBA has been saying is that basically we know that ESG risks will impact the way companies perform and also individuals, but here try to put the focus more on the corporate side. I mean, we have the right mechanisms in terms of identifying defaults. Indeed, the definition of default that was put forward back to 2016 has already sufficient flexibility to cope with other indicators of unlikeliness to pay. So definition of default won't be a case for any bank. In terms of data, what EBA is stating is, yes, we believe that the reference data set will not be comprehensive enough to somehow to capture all ESG related events, and therefore that could be an issue in terms of bringing in additional risk factors that will be tested and confirm their adequacy, in the same way that basically when we look to how to adjust the models, some messages here need to be somehow reminded. And basically EBA is stating that, yes, look for additional risk factors, try to understand if the reference data set somehow supported their inclusion and of course their potential contribution. If that is not the case, there is a sort of golden rule. And the golden rule is the integration of those factors should not deteriorate model performance, or at least should not materially impact the way models are performing. In terms of such introduction of those risk factors, basically EBA is stating, yes, that can be done by simply adding new variables to the model. It could be also act on the sort of derogations. It could be additional conservatives on very specific parts of the model that indeed should reflect such situation. And that's basically what we have here in this slide. So any kind of additional variable or additional risk factor being inputted, if it is anchored somehow on expert judgment, extra challenge should be brought into the equation. That's something that should be demonstrated, that indeed there is a kind of effect, a translation on increased risk, credit risk profile, either through increased frequency of default or even in terms of reduction of the prospects of any recovery. When we talk specifically about calibration, so risk quantification, what somehow EBA is stating is we really don't agree on the fact that if you increase your conservatism on a broader perspective, covering potentially segments that will not be so much impact by CE factors, try to create additional calibration segments that somehow could resize and refocus the effects where those are expected to be most meaningful. We all know that, and people that are engaged on model changes, they know that then whenever you have new calibration segments, that you need to demonstrate that indeed they have a specific meaning and they are materially different from other segments. But in reality, we understand the solution in practical terms. Sometimes it's not so easy to justify them over time. When you have MOC to somehow as the most immediate solution, what EBA is stating, only use MOC A and B. So typically anchor on potential transformations that you may have on the credit lending process, or when you look to MOC A, specifically issues that you may have in your data or methodologies linked to the use of such data that somehow should be addressed through this additional conservatism. When you use the overrides, typically you need to identify which cases are most evident that indeed there is an increased signs of deterioration from the client's creditworthiness, and therefore try to keep this in the limited level of overrides. Otherwise, that will put at risk the credibility of the model. Basically, this is the message of the EBA. When we read the last version of the ECB guide to internal models, basically, I mean, the messages are fully aligned. So what ECB is stating, well, follow the process, see risk factors as any other risk factors, they need to be tested, they need to be included in the model as a regular process. Please do not go against any other main requirements that we have put forward. Do not spoil all the work that we've done so far, and try to justify this as much as possible with the evidences, either justified with data or with expert judgment that needs to be further somehow challenged. And that's basically what ECB is stating, ending up with a point of MOC being used as a kind of a miracle solution is not acceptable. It needs to be anchored to deficiencies that were detected basically on the data side, and therefore there is an explanation for keeping with that. In terms of reactions and what we have seen also from the market and across different studies or across many supports that we have been provided, basically banks try to use some qualitative variables, and that has been basically the use, and in other cases we are also seeing a kind of scorecards that somehow may guide and size the number of overrides. And in many cases, what we see is banks trying to understand, mostly on sectoral information, but also in some client-specific data, try to classify what could be the level of exposure to CE risks, basically, or mostly focus on the transition side. And if there are really evidences of a high risk CE exposure, try to act over downgrading under the umbrella of the overrides. And basically, through dedicated scorecards or simply as a direct variable or acting in terms of overrides, that has been the most, I will say, easy way banks are acting in trying to use the current models and try to adapt them to reality. As I said, that is not so easy to address as it is linked to the future. Okay, moving now to a very important development that occurred beginning of this year. Indeed, it's fully aligned with what was somehow the public consultation version that we saw mostly 1 year ago. But basically, EBA published their final guidelines on the management of ESG risks, as we were expecting, in particular on exposure-based method. they are stating that the overall assessment of the obligors default risk should be comprehensive enough. It should cover all the geographical locations, the different business models, and indeed all kind of vulnerabilities that are linked to, in particular, environmental risks. And if that is the case, yes, banks need to understand what could be the impact on the default risk of their own clients. And that makes a clear bridge to what we have been discussing in terms of how rating and scoring models could be adjusted precisely to include ESG-related variables. In this regard, ESG or CE, I mean, they are not exactly or technically the same, but most often we are always talking about the environmental side, and that's the most, I would say, critical part of all this equation. So what we have here is basically EBA signaling what could be the way out and their expectation of the increased default risk being also incorporated in the models. Another important involvement here is how EBA is seeing the link between the factors and credit risk. So what could be the transmission channels, how physical risks can indeed impact clients' creditworthiness. In terms of transition risks, what typically are the nature of the shocks and how they will impact, for instance, the balance sheet and the P&L. And that's basically critical points that also from the EBA side, it is being somehow announced and communicated to the market. And in particular, in this regard, EBA was quite clear on the type of data that they think is fundamental to somehow to collect information and then to work on what could be the transmission channels to the physical, to the, I would say, the financial side of any company. And what we have here is a long list, some examples indeed of what is data related with environment, data related more on the social and governance side. Here on the social, I will tend to see that the value chain and the impacts through the value chain typically are the ones that have more visible effect on the financial perspective, but basically all of this is now becoming much more clear to all of us what kind of data is really critical and has a connecting point with the financial, basically the P&L of a company. And that's basically the final message here. From a Pillar 1 perspective, we know that the models that have been enhanced in the last years and all the information that is now becoming increasingly available, banks' models are capable of somehow adapting to the reality that we are facing today. So either one of the three acting points that I just mentioned in terms of adjusting what could be, or either underlying scoring or basically the final rating, somehow this reality, most challenging reality is being captured. But we should not stay only in terms of what we have been doing so far, because typically we may say that it's clearer than ever what will be the effects that the companies will face. We have now most credible sources of projections of many of the dimensions that I mentioned, like the cost of energy, the carbon shock. So every details that are now available, they really provide you with sufficient information to understand per sector what could be the consequences. So data is more than ever being available, but data focus on projections. And basically every day we see banks taking decisions about credit lending on, and in many cases, financing exposures over a horizon of 5, 8, 10 years. And that's basically what could be our main point here is more than ever, we have credible information. We know that the decisions can be really impacting banks' balance sheet in the next years. So this appeals to, I will say, a more strategic perspective. And basically what we have here is we know, because we have information about what could be the assessment from a CE perspective of each client. We know what is its credit risk assessment, so viability is in a very important dimension. We need to try to somehow to cope these two perspectives, these two axes that we see here in the graph, trying to understand that clients that will face a very harsh transition, but they are in a, I would say, very good financial situation. So it may be viable, the transition. Yes, banks should continue to finance. If this viability is being put at risk or it's very limited, probably banks should put in equation any kind of deleveraging strategy. And that's basically going further that we have seen so far, not so much focus on how the current rating models may allow you to project PDs over 1 year horizon, is try to go for a longer perspective, a longer time horizon, because any funding being ready right now probably will only face any of these challenges probably within 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. So basically it's a very different time horizon that is here being somehow taken consideration. And what I would like here to state is that this viability assessment does not require us to have different rating models. What it requires from us is that we simply look to the data that is available, in many cases the projection of the relevant CE risk factors, and try to understand how banks' business plans will be, or the business plans the bank have available regarding their own clients are going to be impacted. And what we have here is basically, we know what are the key financial ratios that our models are using to assess, in particular, financial risk for the clients. We know exactly through the different projections and per sector what will be the estimates in terms of energy, in terms of carbon, in terms of capex, and that's altogether would allow banks, or should allow banks, to have a much more forward-looking perspective of what will be the client's risk profile, as I said, in 3, 5, 7 years time horizon. So the actual credit risk rating, it will meet what is expected. What we should really fight to have on an accurate or at least reliable manner is the expectation, the outlook of the evolution of the credit risk rating over a very different horizon. And that will allow us precisely to incorporate those effects, those expectations that we have on the materialization of the CE risks. You may say that in many segments, this information could be available. For others, it will be very difficult. What we have here in this slide, and I will try to close my session very quickly. So what we have here is, depending on the different sources, we have pros and cons. In many cases, for top large corporates, many of these relevant information is already available, so it's easier to take that in consideration. As soon as we go down, in particular for SMEs, it becomes much more difficult. We know that in some countries, some system-wide ESG data platforms are being developed. They are being sponsored, in some cases even by the government, local governments. We also know that banks are also pushing significantly on their internal gathering processes. So many sources of information that would allow you, immediately, but also on an ongoing basis, to try to feed those estimates that I've just referred about what are the critical CE risk factors that you know that somehow will impact the future credit worthiness of the clients. And how can you somehow make the connection between this data and, in fact, what could be the evolution of a client's P&L is basically what we have here in this slide. So we know that there is climate shocks being expected. You may somehow decompose them on energy side, on carbon side, and also on the investment that is being required. For any of these variables, there is already on the public side estimates that are credible about evolutions, and in many cases well above 10, 15 years. So probably we won't go too far, but for the following years, those will be relevant. It will allow you to understand for the key financial variables that you have already in your model, what could be the effects and the expected shocks, how they will be translated in terms of the main credit risk variables. There is a part that typically is difficult to understand, which is the elasticity. So we know that costs will tend to be, to be effective. We know that the way this increase of costs will impact the final price of the goods or the services will depend on the elasticity that is linked to each sector. So in some cases, you can pass to the end consumer the increase of costs. In others, probably it will be the company perceived to assume that, and it will be also faced to competition. So all of these being connected would allow you to move from what are sectorial figures, going to the different sectors, understanding which factors are most relevant depending on the activity of the clients, and then moving here, as you can see in the slide, from the first column until the last column, where you can see what is the expected increase or decrease on production, what is the expected variation on consumption, as I said, also depending on the elasticity that the end goods will have depending on the nature of the products or services that are being sold. We know what could be the impact in terms of increase of interests. We know what could be, at the end of the day, the impact on the key P&L metrics. And that would allow you precisely to work on the outlook of the rating. So in the future, it will be no longer the evolution of the macroeconomic conditions that will lead the evolution of the rating. So the rating migration matrices, it will also need to take in consideration all these external components, in particular the CE risks, and as we said, and we have been seeing in the last, I will say, 3-4 months, is also from a geopolitical side. I mean, the nature of the effects will also be very similar to the ones that we are seeing here from an environmental perspective. And that's basically the message that I would like to leave is, yes, we should continue to work on enhancing our models, enhancing the data structure, trying to fine-tune the variables on different dimensions that are available, but looking ahead of the curve and working on the projections is fundamental. And EBA also published in January this year their consultation still, but a very clear document in terms of scenario analysis that banks will need to apply starting on the beginning of next year. But as you can see, all the methodologies that is being conceived by EBA is very focused on shocks, on specific variables. So your capacity to analyze transition risks, physical risks, and then rechannel all these impacts into the balance sheet and the P&L is something that will need to continue to develop in the next years. And therefore, from a credit risk perspective, all these capabilities should somehow be coordinated, not only for those exercises of scenarization for stressing purposes, but also on the base scenario to understand what will be the evolution of the client's ratings over time. You may ask that with Omnibus, probably there is no room for ESG on risk modeling because there will be a very aggressive slowdown. We don't believe in that. We know that there is a clear refocus. We know that climate and energy transition is a pillar for EU economy. We know that the burden that some companies, in particular smaller ones, were facing in terms of reporting, yes, it's be clearly addressed through the Omnibus, but there are some questions for banks, and in particular, banks will need to fund all these transition efforts. And the focus on the importance of banks is clearly stated. It will be in the most difficult context for banks because, in fact, with less available data coming directly from the clients, banks will need to find a way of somehow using the sources, the public sources that are available, to consider such information in assessing what is the evolution of clients' creditworthiness. And that's a very important point here, that banks should not somehow leave behind their capacity to understand or to carry out the proper risk assessment. So the less potential for information being available is not an excuse for somehow lagging behind on their risk assessment, I will say, capacity. And as a final message, yes, both EBA and ECB, they are quite keen on banks continue to enhance their models. Don't do that at the cost of significantly reduce the capacity and the performance of those models to project the future in terms of recoveries, but also in terms of default frequency. EBA signaled clearly in the beginning of this year that there is a lot of information. We know much more today than we did or we knew 3 or 4 years ago about the different transition channels and the impacts in terms of a financial side. From the business as usual perspective, yes, the models will address the current reality, but we need to look ahead and basically try to invest on your rating outlooks is a very important point, especially in such volatile and uncertain times that we live today. So Omnibus is not an excuse. It's precisely the opposite. It eagers from our side to focus and to invest in progressing where it's really most relevant to us. And this is it from my side.
Okay, then we have a number of questions, and I would like to simply moderate who will answer them. I think this one question goes to you, Ozan. Question is, I mean, what kind of macro factors one should be using in the PD calibration? The person who was asking this question also was referring to the fact that they were using macro factor indicators in the PD overlay for IFRS 9 impairment calculation. As for the forward-looking aspects, yeah, and that's maybe you want to address this about the factors, macro factors. Ozan.
Yes, so actually for selection of macro factors, although the downturn methodologies for LGD, still the paper for downturn identification, the factors mentioned there, it's I think still relevant. Regarding with using macroeconomical variables inside of the model, if I understand the question correctly, I'll comment from IRB models perspective. Usually what we see is not using macroeconomical factors inside of the IRB model because most of the banks do not want to introduce any point in time properties inside of the model. That's why usually the tendency is not to include macroeconomical factors into the model. Yes.
Yeah, and there's another question which is partially related to the first one. One of our attendants also was asking, is there really a need for threshold? Defining a threshold is acceptable from supervisor perspective. He believes that it wasn't necessary in his case. I think his bank went through a trim X, and they believe that it is not acceptable, and they want to consider persistent increase in bad year versus a good year.
Yes, so for this question, this approach, like defining a threshold from our side, it's approved several times without any finding regarding with the methodology. I think it matters how this threshold is defined, because this analysis is the main purpose is define this threshold to keep to both reflect own default rates and also macroeconomical indications or macroeconomical environments, because we also define the actual economical crisis to assess expected number of bad years, and also their duration sometimes, because some crises might create like several bad years in a row, and indeed like persistent default rate increase might be an indicator for bad years, but it's also should be justified with several things. For example, what is actually the persistent default rate increase? Like how many years are we talking about, or how many, I don't know, what's the frequency of the data, like how many months or how many years is natural, might be a random increase due to or another reasons, and what is indication of bad economy. And for example, there are some situations we see that increase is like more like a shock. It happens once, then it decreases again. For example, during COVID, during the payment holidays, default rates was quite low because of the holiday, but when payment holiday ended, the observation just defaulted due to 90 DPD trigger being active again, and there was a shock for 1 year. And for example, this is something maybe we cannot capture with persistent increase in default rate. So that's why a threshold directly based on a default rate, yeah, it was the approach for us that being approved several times.
Okay, then we have another question. This is this time I think a similar one. The question is, should we consider macroeconomic factors during PD Pillar 1 calibration? I think I can answer that. I think we don't usually use for Pillar 1 models macroeconomic factors for risk quantification that simply tilt the model to a point in time juncture, to a point in time, I would say, trajectory, which we usually try to avoid simply because the IRB models have to be rather compliant with the minimum requirement, which is looking back to a more average default rate through the cycle default rate. So point in time properties embedded into one model is not necessarily the preferable, let's say, orientation of any PD model. Yeah, I think this one also goes to you, unfortunately, because you have been answering all the questions, Ozan. Question is this: based on your practices, did you observe cliff effects treatment in the PD Pillar 1 model? If the answer is yes, what are the main indicators of triggers for the optimization of this process? We observe, she's referring to her own bank, probably, significant impact mostly in the standardized risk cost. Yeah, maybe we can take the answers shortly.
Yeah, very, very shortly from cliff effect, I think usually the approach that we did to avoid to have cliff effect is for both performing and in default models actually trying to keep at least the main risk drivers more or less similar or some kind of derivation to each other. This was, I think, one of the best approaches to avoid cliff effect, I would say. I think there's a second part of the question. We observe in our bank significant impact, mostly in the standard risk cost. In RWA and IFRS 9 impairment, the impact is just transfer earlier rather than change scorecard to model behavior. Okay, this is more of a comment. So yeah, in terms of the first part, like regarding with the cliff effect, that's what would I say.
Okay, then we have another question. Small. This time, I think Jose should probably be taking it. If you can come in, Jose, it would be nice. Do you have some benchmark on LGD expected levels between IRB and IFRS 9 models? Is the question.
Benchmark, no, but typically, even in a long run perspective, meaning without any type of specific adjustments from IRB or IFRS 9 side, like MOC or in the IFRS 9 side, the point in time calibration or forward looking, we observe that LGDs from IRB are always higher. This because mainly three reasons. For one side, the recovery costs, which include general costs components like wages, costs related with buildings where recovery teams work, for example. The discount rate, so the EBA guidelines discount rate of Euribor plus the 5 points, it's quite demanding for a majority of portfolios. And third component, typically we have been observing that whenever there is a distinction between the model design applied in IRB vis-a-vis the model design in the IFRS 9 side, the IFRS 9 side in majority of cases is somehow designed to be very efficient on, in other words, to be able to reduce the level of expected loss when compared to something driven by IRB. In that sense, this gap can be even higher if fundamentals like the regulatory floor, the weighting based on number, the cash flow for cures, the artificial cash flow for cures not being discounted, other fundamentals, if they are not yet embedded in the IFRS 9 model, of course, this gap between models can be even higher in terms of impacts.
Okay, I see. Well, we have two more questions. I will. I'd like to address one of them. The last one is about could you expand on why logistic regression is not able to capture climate risk? I don't think it has anything to do with logistic regression. I don't think any modeling methodology cannot capture climate risk, because we usually look in the credit risk model development space into a very short period of time. Usually it's 10, 15 years maximum, whereas the climate risk events usually happen on much longer time periods. We usually talk about 40 years, 30 years and more. And so it's not about the regression, not about the, general speaking, methodologies to forecast and predict the impact. It's more like about availability of data and the data, sets having the same time frame to come up with proper assessment. And one last question is, PD LG, the regulatory floor based on CR requirements, do you expect adjustments in IFRS not to apply this process? No, we don't expect anything like that, because these are two different things and completely two different frameworks. One has not to be exactly the same as the other one. The objectives are obviously different, so we don't expect any such floors in the future time. But who knows? There are sometimes regulators coming up with ideas that even, surprise all of seasoned modelers in one way or other. So I think we came today to the end of our webinar. Many thanks for joining us. We will hope to have your presence and attendance, participation again in the next ones that will probably take place after the summer break. And much appreciated for your participation. Wish?
Yeah, I think this is it. So thank you very much for your time and attention, interest, and we'll come back soon, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Another topics that are highly important for all of us.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Should you have questions, feel free to send us this. You will receive the slide deck, and you will have the contact details as well. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.